Um, the Chancery Court, it's a huge subject, and I could probably talk for 3 hours about it. So I'm going to try and squeeze a lot of knowledge into a very short time. What is the Court of Chancery? Well, it was a civil court. It was a court of equity. The records run for a very long time. A lot of people think that they're only sort of medieval or Tudor, but no, they go right on into the 20th century. The good thing about the records is that they are all written and they're not verbal, unlike the criminal courts, where there isn't very much actual written evidence. Why would you use Court of Chancery records? Well, if you're interested in anything at all to do with history, places, people, houses, there is no end to the subjects that can be found within the Chancery records. I mentioned it was an equity court. There were actually several equity courts. The principal one was Chancery, but the others are Star Chamber requests. Both those two were abolished in 1641. And then the Exchequer Court, which ran up until the 1840s. What's good about the court is that there was one legal procedure for all cases, unlike the common law. There were all sorts of benefits. It was what people said about the Court of Chancery was that the judgment was what a good man of moral conscience would do. So it's not relying on very strict legal precedent or anything like that. It's much more equitable. It's also, if you didn't have your documentary evidence, which you needed for the common law, you could bring your case to the Chancery Court. So how many records are there? Well, there are 10 miles of Chancery records. So whatever your place you're studying, whatever subject you're studying, there is almost bound to be something within the Chancery records which are kept at the National Archives. The pleadings have been catalogued, which is very good on Discovery online. Other records, and each case is not kept together. Every single type of record for any one case will be in a separate class of records, but there are very good paper calendars at the National Archives to help you through the sort of myriad of different records you might be looking at. National Archives, it's quite difficult to find pictures for Chancery records other than giving you an endless list of documents you could be looking at, or pictures of documents themselves. But I will give you one picture of a document. This is one we're going to be looking at a bit later for one of the examples. As you can see, the records are handwritten. They're sometimes a bit damaged, but generally they are in quite good condition. So what records are there? And remember, they will be kept separately generally. You get the bill of complaint. That's the plaintiff putting their side of the story, and you believe it. You believe every word. You feel huge sympathy for the plaintiff. Then you read the answer put by the defendant. You realise there's a lot more to it. Then each of the parties could set up a list of questions to put to their own chosen witnesses, who would answer only those questions relevant to what they actually knew. So those are the depositions. Then you'd get orders and decrees. A lot of those can be quite dull. It's just usually the defendant saying, I need a bit more time or something like that. But eventually you do get a lot of information about the case towards the end. Then the last two, affidavits and master's exhibits, can be some of the most interesting records. The master's exhibits are where people have brought documents along as evidence and they've left them behind in the court. They were supposed to take them home, but they don't always. And there's a huge variety of documents within the master's exhibits. So what else about the records? Well, they're in English, which is unlike a lot of legal records, which were in Latin until the 1730s. As I've said, they're reasonably legible, they're generally in good condition, and they are all at the National Archives. And that's what a typical bill of complaint will look like. It can be slightly daunting, but once you know your way around them, you just get immersed in them. They are completely absorbing. You're delving into other people's lives, and you'll find a lot of spoken word in them. People will report so-and-so said this, so you get actual verbatim records of what somebody will have said. You get descriptions of their characters, you get to know them as people, and you get terrific descriptions of places as well. If you're interested in fields, you'll get the field names, you'll get the names of the tenants. You get accounts quite often as well, which can be really valuable information. Not all of them are looking quite as daunting as the one I just showed you. This is a much more modern case, and these are some typical records of more modern ones. As you can see at the bottom of the screen, they're in print towards the end of the 19th century, which makes it much easier. So what sort of people brought cases to the Chancery Court? Some people believe that it was rich people only. Well, no, absolutely not. As you can see from my list, it's every type of person will bring a case. I've included servants there. Servants generally don't bring cases, but they will be brought forward as witnesses to give evidence, to give depositions, as they're called. And so you will find a lot about servants. I remember one case I looked at where the butler was, this was at quite a fancy house, but the butler was brought in to give evidence about having made the brother of the owner of the house drunk so that the brother signed away all his rights to the property. And so we had a great lot of detail about how much drink was produced. Now, this particular webinar is about institutions. So I've obviously included, do you find records about institutions in Chancery? Of course you do. You find everything within Chancery courts. And of course you do find the rich as well. So what sort of institutions might be included? Well, pretty much anything you can think of. And you'll see on screen, I've got a few examples. Workhouses, as we've heard about from Helen. Lunatics and lunatic asylums appear quite frequently. Schools, and you'll be hearing a bit more about that later. Libraries, nonconformist chapels. And then at the bottom, I just put into Discovery, Society and Chancery. And up came hundreds of examples. These are just a few I've picked out to give you a very broad idea of the sort of records. So whatever place you're researching, there will be Chancery cases to do with that place and more than likely about institutions within that place. So this is just to give you an example of some of the entries on Discovery that I found. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but you can see that there's a wide variety and there's usually enough information within the catalogue entry for you to tell whether it's going to be helpful or not. And something like the account book of the workhouse. I mean, would you necessarily look in the Chancery records to find a workhouse account book? No, but you should. You should look in Chancery for absolutely anything and everything. A lot of the records are indexed by place, not all, I'm afraid. So definitely put the place into Discovery to find out what there is. The easiest way is to go into the advanced search box where you can put in the word that you're looking for. So you might put workhouse, the name of your place, and you include the word Chancery, and that should bring up hundreds of cases, you hope. So what are the records? They're the pleadings, the bill and the answer, then the depositions. And as I said, the exhibits can be some of the most interesting records. There was a business I was researching in Glasgow, and they brought a case against one of their employees who had been in America selling the cotton that they were making. And there was a long dispute about whether the man in America had actually been doing what he should, but the entire business archive ended up as exhibits. So just have a look at amongst the exhibits. There will be all sorts of things relating to the place that you're interested in. So I'm now going to talk about a couple of specific cases. In 1615, there was a case brought about the Tiverton Free School, and there's a picture of it. Now, there was a great dispute about this by a man who was brought in to be the schoolmaster, and he brought the case because he wasn't paid for the work he did. And so what happened? We find out a vast amount about the school itself from the records. We find out that the land was bought and they paid £60 for it. We find the name of the builder, who was at the same time building his own house. And that's one of the problems, in that a lot of the work was being done on his own house rather than being done actually on the school itself. But we learn that the school cost £400 to build, and it consisted of 4 rooms. But work stopped for 2 years. And then we find that this schoolmaster who came had found that the building was unfinished. And so he then set up school in a building across the road. But he was eventually dismissed without pay. That's why he brought the Chancery case. So that's a picture of the records that I had a look at in order to find out more about this case. And another picture of the school itself. And then there's a detail saying that when it was founded and who built it and so on. The town were very proud of this school, but there's this rather dark story that goes on before it was finished. So we get a lot of names mentioned in relation to this. The complainant is the school teacher, William Titherley, and the defendant. These records are very name rich. So if you want to know who lived in a place, have a look at the Chancery records. You will find such a wide variety of people being named. We also get the depositions, and the records for this case, actually, it's the depositions that are the most interesting. And every deposition, the person is asked for their name, where they live, what their occupation is, and their age. And there's a wide variety of age. It tends to be older people in a lot of the cases. And we always hear that, oh, the average age of death was 40 something. Well, you get plenty of people in their 80s, in their 90s even. Not everybody died young. There were plenty who lived. I got one woman who was aged 100, apparently. I mean, maybe she wasn't actually 100, but she was certainly obviously very old. And then we have more examples of depositions. And again, you can see the number of people that are going to be named. So if you're researching the history of Tiverton, this would be a wonderful document for you to look at. Now, this is the place where they actually were holding the school while the other one was being built. And this is where the trouble comes, because it was described as being wild, large, open, and very cold. Not the nice, comfortable building it looks as though it is today. It wasn't glazed, although they actually used the word fenced against the weather. There was a common yarn market every Monday in the same room where the teaching happened, in the schoolroom. And the lower room was an alehouse. I mean, just so brilliant for children going to school, having to pass through this alehouse. And then it turns out that this teacher actually wasn't very good. And some of the children were said to be worse at reading than they were when they started with this teacher. So there's two sides to this, as always in Chancery. You sympathise with him because he hasn't been paid. He's had to teach in this very unsuitable building, but it then turns out he actually wasn't very good at it. But we also get a list of the former school teachers. So we learn that Mr. Brown, Mr. Worth, Mr. Canley, Mr. Varley, and Mr. Battler were former teachers in the school. And then one of the witnesses says that he had a son there and thought it was totally unreasonable to teach children in such an extremely cold place. Now, I mean, I've at an age where the school I went to was cold, and we were definitely brought up to think that cold didn't matter. I think these days everything's rather more comfortable. But for people in 1615 to be saying that it was cold, it must have been absolutely freezing. Sort of reminds us of the last few days we've had here. So that's one case, that's one type of thing you could be looking at, a school. Now, another institution on a completely different scale. This is the British Museum, which I'm sure many of you will recognise. And the case I'm going to be talking about very briefly for this concerns a man called William White. And he made a will. He died in 1824, and he only had one son, William John White, who he felt wasn't suitable really to inherit all his land. William White was a rich man. This is completely in contrast to the 1615 case where we're dealing with rather more ordinary people. William White, he was a wealthy man. He owned property all over the country. He left everything to his son, but on condition that the son was to be looked after. So we get the feeling that possibly the son was probably not capable. However, the son died very shortly after him and after he made the will. So what happens? We find that his wife had a life interest in his land and his mother had a life interest. So we then find a number of Chancery cases that immediately follow his will and his death. And what's this all about? Well, he said that if his son died, then all his property was to be put in trust for the British Museum to build another wing because they were very short of space. So we often hear that Chancery cases go on for a long time. Well, in this case, that's absolutely true. The cases were mainly brought in the 1820s, but Caroline Avis White, who's his wife, didn't die until 1879. So she had the life interest of the property till then. So the British Museum were getting very itchy feet. Come on, just die, woman, die. Please get out of the way. We want to inherit all this money so we can build our new wing. There then follows a great deal of description about how the building was going to be done, where the wing was to be. And sorry, this is a family tree showing William, it's just to make it a bit clearer. So we've got William White, it dies, son's already dead, his wife has a life interest and his mother did as well. And you get the references for the documents there. So what do we learn about the British Museum at this time? Well, all sorts of fascinating detail, like the fact that in 1862, they moved the natural history collection to South Kensington. They also had growing collections of Greco-Roman and Oriental sculpture. But at that time, they were looking for more space to be able to house their wonderful new collections. So it was decided that they were going to build this new wing, and they were very excited. It cost £60,000, and it was going to be built in the garden of the principal librarian, who was very happy about this. Everybody seems to think this was just a wonderful opportunity. And one thing that William said in his will was that there was a little vanity of no harm that may tempt others to follow my example in thinking more of the nation and less of themselves. He wanted there to be a frieze along the top of it. And you can see, this is just a tiny extract from the will. It was to be in Latin, and it was to have his name, William White, British, said that this building was to be put, the building was his bequest to the country. So this is a case of a rich man donating to an institution. Now, I would suggest that if you have anybody in the area of the place that you're researching who has a decent amount of money, have a look at their wills, because wills are one of the most common sources of dispute, which will end up in Chancery, where you'll get so much more information than is in the will itself. So if you want to know more about Chancery records, this is a tiny plug for my books. And this is the quickest I have ever gone through Chancery records. They are a fabulous source. They're full of so much information, institutions, places, people, and just about everything else. So with that whistle-stop tour, I will say thank you.